Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. Now, China's formal division of its citizens into rural and urban residents, according to the household registration, or Hukou system as it's known here, has long puzzled or at least intrigued outsiders. But now this Hukou system is, along with the way that land is transferred and owned in China, causing some problems for the government in its stated goal of urbanizing the vast majority of its rural population. Well, to discuss urbanization, some of the reforms that have been announced in that Hukou system and other aspects of land reform in China, I'm delighted today to be joined by a recognized expert in the field, Professor Tao Ran of Renmin University. Professor Tao has spent many years both writing about and studying urbanization, local governments and land reform in China. Professor Tao Ran, welcome to On the Level.
My pleasure.
Now, urbanization. The government has said here that it wants to urbanize China. It wants to bring people from the countryside into the cities. Why is that so important?
Because for any country in development, urbanization is a way that a country modernizes. Only when you draw people out of agriculture into the manufacturing and service sector, the country's per capita GDP and living standard can improve. That has been the case for all the developed countries. So China is also in the middle of urbanization. To promote productivity, you have to transfer people out of the agriculture and into manufacturing and service sector, and this sector in the city.
You said it's in the middle of this process at the moment. We heard recently, I think it was 2011, that a sort of a borderline was passed and that more than 50% of China's residents were considered urban. At least that's where they were living at that time. What is the goal for a developing country like China? Is there a sort of a 60% or a number of the population?
Yeah, if you reached the level of development, of most developed countries, it should be 90, 95, something like that.
Right.
Yeah, you'd only need very small proportion of people who work in the countryside as farmers to produce food for people who live in the cities.
Right.
Thanks to the technology, breakthroughs in agriculture. The official statistics is that, only about 37 or 38 of the Chinese population have urban household registration. Mm-hmm. And the remaining, between 51 to 37 is about over 200 million migrant workers who have been working in the cities for quite a long time, but they don't have formal urban household registration card.
Right. Now, you can't just go out into the countryside and say to people, right, you're moving into the city tomorrow and that's the end of the story. So how does the government encourage people to move from the countryside into the cities?
Actually, the government have not encouraged people. And these people, they came for jobs, because they're good jobs in the cities. Mm-hmm. In particular in China, it's the coastal cities and in particular large cities that provide jobs. Actually, government in China, local government, in the past have been working hard to restrict, the movement of people from the rural to the city. But that restriction has been relaxed in the past, 2 decades gradually, mm-hmm. because they need these people to do the job. Mm-hmm. Back in the 1980s or 1990s, mm-hmm. the restriction for free migration has been quite serious. But now it's much more easier because cities begin to realize that, for the city to grow, you have to have cheap labor. And China's countryside is where the cheap labor can come from.
There is a problem for the people that are moving in from the countryside into the city, and that is this system which is called in China the Hukou system, a household registration system. So maybe we should explain a little bit about that, the background of it. Why was it there in the first place, and what did it achieve?
Actually, this Hukou system was installed back in late 1950s. I mean, that actually was China's great leap forward period. At that time, China, the country, went crazy by, pushing forward heavy industrialization in the cities. They not only invested huge money in heavy industry, they also recruited a lot of farmers rural laborers into the cities to build all these heavy industries. But it turned out to be a big disaster. And then they have to send people back to the countryside. And then they also began to install a Hukou system that, you cannot come to the city without Hukou.
So it's sort of almost like a passport or a visa which allowed you to move into the cities.
Yeah, at that time it was like an internal passport system.
Right.
Because at that time with Hukou, without urban Hukou, you cannot even get food because the food is rationed. But after middle 1990s, as China's food market become liberalized, people can afford to go to the cities and purchase food on the free market. So that's actually the start of the tiny migration in China, but large-scale migration actually happened only after middle 1990s, when the township and village enterprises in the countryside, which boomed in the 1980s, began to decline, and cities began to grow, and jobs began to be generated in the cities after middle 1990s, in particular after 2000. Rural migrants began to emerge in the cities on a huge scale.
Now you've mentioned these Hukous as being rural or urban, but essentially they do tie people to a particular city, a particular town, or a particular part of the countryside. How are they looked on these days at the moment? Are they accepted? Do people hate them? Does it depend which side of the divide you're on?
People would hate them if they move. As I mentioned, back in the 1950s or even in the 1980s, Hukou actually is related with everything. But as labor markets gradually liberalized in the 1990s, Hukou now is related to less and less. For example, if you can be a farmer from central China and you can find a job, in manufacturing or service sector in Beijing, you don't need a Hukou. Unless it's a state-owned, a sector, but there are a lot of private employers. You can also be a self-employed. So jobs and job-related, for example, benefits such as insurances are not closely related to Hukou anymore.
Right. So what does it mean to somebody who is in a city like Beijing, for example, but has a Hukou from somewhere else in the countryside? How is it going to affect their daily life and the way they live with their family?
There are mainly three benefits. Okay. Actually, there are other small benefits. But the major three is, first, the minimum livelihood guarantee system, which is a social assistance system. For example, if I'm a migrant from Hunan province, I don't have a Beijing Hukou, and if I lose my job or lose my working ability, I wouldn't have access to this minimum livelihood guarantee provided by Beijing local government, because they will give you a little bit of money that you don't work, but you can still survive. But this actually does not really mean much, because most people, migrants, almost everyone have a job. If you don't have a job, they will just go back to the cities, to the countryside. The second thing is more important, is equal access for your children, for migrant children, to urban public school in the city where they migrate into. Okay, if I don't have a Hukou in Beijing, my children will not have access to urban public school.
So this is policy. Beijing. They're barred from going to the schools, or is it simply the school policy?
Actually, it's the central government back in 2002 already said that urban public school should accept migrant children unconditionally, without extra charges. But even today, you don't see that policy is being implemented. Local governments find always to, to prevent these migrant children to come into to urban public school. So that actually is a big deal for many migrants, because then they have to leave their children behind.
Right.
And sometimes, a husband, in principle, they should work with the wife and the children. But if the children go back to the countryside, the wife has to go with him or her.
So this can result in families being split up?
Yes, yes. So that's the second part. And the third part, which is also very important, if you are a migrant, usually you don't have access to public housing scheme provided by the city. And we all know that in many cities, in most cities in China, in particularly in coastal cities where these migrants, come to find jobs, the housing price is excessively high. And now the government is trying to provide public housing, but most of this housing, don't target migrant workers.
So those are 3 points you mentioned. The social assistance is not available, education for children, and access to affordable housing, public housing.
Yeah.
Something that you often hear people talking about the Hukou is healthcare. Is that anything? Would you have access to healthcare in a hospital here in Beijing if you're ill, or not, because you have a Hukou from another part of the country?
If you have a job in the formal sector that pays you health insurance, usually they should, but not all migrants they pay this health insurance. Then, in principle, you have access to health care. But for most migrants, they actually have some health care system back in the countryside. And also, some of them also pay health insurance in the cities. So sometimes they can choose between two,
So it's not actually a bar to healthcare, but it could affect it. If they have their insurance back in the countryside, they would tend to go back to somewhere where it's paid for.
Yes.
The People's Daily recently had an interesting, it was talking about this aspect. It says, in megacities such as Beijing, the Hukou is a basic requirement for young girls when choosing boyfriends. Okay. So it seems to have a social aspect as well, that an urban Hukou is considered of a higher class than the countryside. Is that something that affects people who come from outside the cities?
Yes, it does, actually. And unfortunately, this is tragedy because, you find young girls looking for a Beijing boyfriend, and that's very tragic. Yeah, and so that's why people are very unhappy about it. And but it's very difficult because to get rid of them.
You actually wrote about this some time ago in a newspaper here, the China Daily, and you said at that stage, when you were looking forward to this, there was 3 things that you felt were important. First, Hukou reform could not be successful. It was just applied to small cities, opened up, and it left out the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai and so on. Second, you said it shouldn't only be allowed for workers from rural areas of the same province, that people should be able to move across provinces. And thirdly, you said, what we were just speaking about there, that the Hukou reform should also offer these people Hukou-linked public services, such as accessible housing, education for their children, social assistance. Of the Hukou reforms, as we've heard about them now, how has that panned out compared to what you were looking for back in 2010?
As you can see, in this new proposal for Hukou reform, there are still some limitation. Actually, they would try to control the size of mega cities, which I think is a very bad policy. Because for most countries in urbanization, in the middle of urbanization is large and super large cities that provide jobs, that provide, opportunities, and migrants go to these cities. Look at Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen. I mean, they all have about or even above 10 million migrant workers. Large cities not only attract young and highly educated migrants, they also attract low-end migrant workers who would provide services. So the large cities need both type high-end and low-end migrants. So
this means that people would be allowed to move to a city, but it had to be a small city, or there were certain limits.
That's the problem. For example, in Beijing, there are already 7, 8, or even 10 million migrant workers.
None of these will receive any benefit from these changes.
Yeah, they're already here, and more will continue to come. It's very difficult to drive them out. How can you, right? I mean, how should you do that? So there's no way actually to implement this policy. It will be very inhuman to drive these people who are already here, who have been here working for a long time, right? You just cannot do this. And it's against the rule or the law of economics, right? So that policy this element actually, seems to me, is just not very, it's questionable.
Right. What about the area of the benefits that Hukou in a city brings? Will these people who go to the cities, are they told that they can get access to housing and social assistance and education?
So for these large cities, then local governments, according to central policy, they would have an excuse not to give the benefits to migrant workers, right? And also I mentioned, so this is number one. The number two issue that I mentioned is that, Hukou should also target migrants from other parts of China, not only local farmers. Actually, in China is a huge country. A lot of migration is from inland provinces to coastal provinces. Okay, so basically now many coastal area cities, even for smaller and medium-sized cities, they actually mainly welcome farmers from their own locality. They don't, welcome migrants. They don't give urban Hukou and related benefits to migrants from other parts of the country, from inland. This new policy says that small and medium-sized city should be open to all migrants. But let me tell you, this, many small and medium-sized city in coastal area, which does provide a lot of jobs, they already set up very high entry barrier for migrant workers. What's known as a point accumulation system, that you have to accumulate, for example, 60 or 80 points out of 100 to ever get a Hukou. That means actually that policy is a discrimination against this less educated, migrants or less experienced migrants, or it's also a very serious discrimination against the self-employed migrants, because they don't pay, social insurances. Actually, there's not a social insurance scheme for them to pay. Self-employed migrants actually accounted for 20% of the all migrants in China and all over the world. So, but actually, these guys that find their own jobs, in the city.
Entrepreneurial types.
Yeah, entrepreneurial types. But and they actually have more, intention to settle down in the cities. But they don't pay social insurance. They don't get the points. And they cannot get Hukou.
So if, as you say, this movement towards these large cities would be beneficial for the country, why the reluctance? Why such small changes in the system, do you think, when there was a chance that larger changes could have been made? What is the reasoning behind that?
Okay, I think that the two reasons. First, it's probably more costly to provide these services to migrants in large cities. Public housing price is extremely high in large cities. Local government don't want to, provide this house to the wretched migrant workers.
So there would be pushback from the local governments in these large cities who would not want this responsibility.
Yeah. Second is that I think the central government, has some responsibility. The idea is that large cities, are too large, that is overcrowded. So we should decentralize or deconcentrate, the population to small and medium-sized cities. This is a very wrong idea. For many countries around the world, you can see, a very large city that could be highly densely populated city that could be managed very well. And also there's huge economy of scale and the economy of agglomeration. So large cities can be managed very well if you have the right policy. It's not necessary that it will be crowded or polluted, all depend on how you manage it. I think China has a lot of lesson and experience to learn from other countries, other large cities in other parts of the world.
So putting yourself in the position of the policymakers here who have made this decision, what do you feel should or could be done to improve the situation then?
Unfortunately I'm not. If I were a central, government planner, I would first, gradually also liberalize the large cities. I mean, any city that could provide good jobs should be open to migrants.
But city dwellers, people who live in the city already, who are the holders of Hukous here, would say our city just simply doesn't have the resources for these people. If we let everybody come in, we'll see shanty towns and we'll see people living as we do in slums in South America. Is that an argument that you feel has an answer?
First, the cities large cities could manage it very well. If, for example, if you use the right pricing, for example, for cars or for water, in terms of, in the case of Beijing, Beijing's water price is very low, lift the price of the water, and then you will save water, right? So resources could always be resolved through the right pricing system. And second, actually, more migrants into the cities, even for large cities, is a good thing for local residents, because then you could find cheap labor, cheap waiters, cheap babysitter, and also for these migrants, they come into the cities, they could actually benefit local farmers in the suburban area, because now, so that's actually a policy that I would propose to the government. Now the housing price in China, in large cities, is very high. But that's related to China's land system. The government monopolize the supply of residential land. Okay, so farmers, local farmers, for example, in Beijing's urban and suburban villages, they have a lot of land they can use to construct rental housing for migrant workers. But under China's current land system, this is illegal. Okay, so make it legal, and then they would respond by building a lot of housing.
Just to explain to people here who might not be aware, in China the land in the cities in theory belongs to the government, and in the countryside it belongs to local cooperatives,
local rural collectives.
And this is the land in the countryside which the farmers, the people who use it at the moment, are not allowed to develop outside of agriculture. Is that right?
They could use their own, for example, residential land or some rural land for their own purpose, but you cannot, build, for example, rental or commodity housing for migrant workers. But if you go to Beijing or if you go to Shenzhen, you find many local farmers, they build house for rental purpose anyway. One difference between China and many other developing countries is that the Chinese economy so far has been very good at generating decent jobs in the cities. That's very different from what you saw in India or Brazil, that many migrants, they don't have job, or they only have very low-end job in the cities, and they don't have the capacity to pay rental income to relatively formal housing. But in China, most migrants have decent jobs, they have quite decent income. If you allow farmers in migrants receiving cities to build rental housing for them, they can afford it. Remember, there are already over 200 million migrant workers. Most of them have decent jobs in the cities. What they need is affordable housing and equal access to urban public school for their children. This is not so difficult to do if we carry out some reform. That could save you costs. And you can even charge local farmers who, build this rental housing. You can charge some income tax on their rental income and use some of the money to pay for migrant children's education. So I think, with good reform, China actually can save money, at the same time accommodate these migrant workers, and that would bring about not only short-term economic growth, for example, due to housing construction, but in the long term, after these people settle down in the cities, they will become more like urban consumers. They would spend more of their income in durable and non-durable goods that would boost domestic consumption.
One question about this rural and urban Hukou is that these people in the countryside do have one advantage. They have the right to use land. And if they take an urban Hukou and become full-time city dwellers, they lose that. A survey found recently, I think it was in Sichuan, that quite a number of people actually said they didn't want to give up that right to the land just in case something happened, and that they didn't want to take an urban Hukou. Could that be a problem, that people might not actually want to do that?
Okay, so many farmers, they don't want to give up their rural land because they find there's no hope to stay in the cities. So, because there's not much real progress in urban Hukou reform. So then, but if you really reform the land system, that's, as I mentioned, if you also open the urban public school for real, okay, to their children, many migrants, they would choose to live in the cities.
So you feel that result is a consequence of the situation at the moment, and that it's just if they were able to invest more in the cities, they would actually move there and make that break, and then you would have more land in the countryside.
Yeah, and then they can sell their rural, land, either residential or farmland, to those who are left behind, and then they can even earn some money that help them to settle down in the cities.
Do you think over the period of this administration we will see stronger reforms, more in-depth reforms? Is this sort of just like testing the water, or is it going to be a very slow process, in your view?
Frankly, I don't know. I think, the government, of course, they know the importance of, the Hukou reform. And actually, China has no time to waste anymore. There are already over 200 million migrant workers in the cities. There's, perhaps an equal number of people, who are left behind for this. Because they're the left behind wives or children of these migrant workers. So, in the next decade, if China can, want to really urbanize successfully, you need to accommodate perhaps 300 or 400 million migrant workers, migrants in the cities. This reform cannot be delayed because these left behind, families are usually broken families.
Do you see that leading to social problems?
Leading not only economically inefficient, but also socially it's very destructive. So China needs to go ahead with this Hukou reform. But local governments always have an excuse, saying this is too expensive. Let's do it a little bit, one step at a time. We don't have much time to waste. But unless the land reform that I mentioned, for example, that allow suburban farmers to build rental housing for migrant workers to live, unless that reform happen, I see no, good prospects for Hukou reform. And so far, I haven't seen any real progress in land reform. Do that land reform, along with some financing reform for education, then the Hukou reform will be easy to, to carry out. And that actually will also bring about economic growth. That actually growth is desperately needed because the Chinese economy is slowing down.
So your message would be that you're not sure, but this is something that is needed right now rather than sometime in the future.
I hope that the government, really realize how urgent we need the Hukou reform and how important land reform is, to a successful Hukou reform.
Professor Taoran, thank you very much for coming on The Level.